welcome back to another episode of
Just
a
squirrel
looking for a
or
nut,
not
trying to get
out
of this
rut. Oh boy, that last part. We're just gonna have to do a whole day. Yeah, we were in a rut, but that's okay. We are here, and we are talking about ethics tonight. Oleg, it is hard being ethical. Sometimes I ask myself, why do I always have to be the good person? You know, I always wondered.
Mm-hmm.
I would hear people say in places that I worked, oh my God, she lies all the time. She's always talking about people behind their backs. Mm-hmm. She abuses the staff. We can't trust her as far as we can throw her. No one believes anything that she says. Hey, let's give her a promotion. Am I the only one that thought that was kind of loop? Why? Why am I the only one that had an issue ethical with that? Seriously.
No, in all seriousness, I find the same situations to be challenging, and it's a challenging, for me, those are challenging situations to be in, because in knowing what you know about any particular individual who may not be ethical when it comes to certain situations, there's just times, at least what I face, is that you just don't know what to do. I mean, do you go to your boss and tell the truth behind what actually happens in the closed doors, or do you keep your mouth shut and just kind of hope that, okay, this is something that you just let it slide by and take its course wherever it takes? But I found myself to be in similar situations. But I think to the same point, though, I'll add on one other thing. I don't know if it's possible to always be ethical for anyone. And what I mean by that is, I mean, there have been situations throughout my life, especially when I was younger, where I probably did things that would be considered, unethical, such as the examples that you described, talking behind someone's back, or doing some of these other things. And it was only through my own experiences and trials and errors that I was able to find the quote unquote ethical ways to behave, whether it came in public or groups, or just even understanding what it means to be a professional. I mean, think about the behaviors. I don't know if you've ever engaged in things like this. I certainly have. That's why I have some compassion for when I receive similar messages. I remember when I first started on LinkedIn, because I was so focused on getting connected to specific groups or professionals, I was that person that sent them that extremely long message that said, hi, this is my name. I would love to come to your company and do this. When the reality is they had no idea who I was. So now when I get similar things, when I get the full-blown PDFs, or sometimes I'm sure you get similar messages where the person says, hey, I really think you would enjoy my book, and here's a free copy of it. And if I had all the time in the world, absolutely, I would be more than happy to read the book and provide whatever feedback. But unfortunately, I don't. So is that considered ethical or unethical because someone doesn't really know who you are and yet proposes something like that out there? So I know it's slightly different from what you started with or what your initial question, but I think it's such a loaded topic to begin with. And there's so many different situations where I personally question what's ethical and what's not, because there is no clean line or clear line sometimes.
Well, that's a good question. And I'll talk about an experience that happened to me in high school that may bring some light to the discussion, or maybe cloud it up even further. Mm-hmm. I worked in a department store, and I knew, as did many people, that, and I'm slightly altering the facts to protect the not so, maybe the innocent or the not so innocent, and maybe to protect myself because I don't remember every single fact perfectly.
Yeah, let the jury decide.
Right, against me and haul mine, into jail. So there was someone who worked in the parking lot who I was an employee, who I and many other people working for that particular retail store that I worked at knew was stealing from the company.
Mm-hmm.
And I know another employee who went and reported that theft to the management of the company, and that person may have gotten fired. At a minimum, they got disciplined. They probably got fired. And I told my dad about it, and he was very, very angry at that individual. He said that person is horrible, not the person who was stealing, the person who reported the thief. That person is horrible. I am appalled by them. And he wouldn't let it go. He hated that person ever after. He said that was not their call to do. They didn't need to be reporting thieves to the management. That was wrong. Where was their solidarity with the other employees? Why were they poking their business into something that really wasn't any of their business? I actually sided with the person that was the quote unquote snitch. I've never really felt that as an ethical matter, there was that much wrong with reporting criminal activity to those that might be able to do something about it, or behavior that was unethical if the person was confronted about it and didn't do anything. But when it came to, for instance, theft, I don't even know that I agreed or would agree that the person who was doing the thieving should be talked to. Because by the time you're old enough to work, you should know that it is wrong to steal from your employer. And so there was clearly an ethical clash between my dad and I about that snitch. He felt that the principal ethical value was solidarity between the people that were employees there. And mine was that if you commit a crime, those that report you are not people you should be angry at. You should be angry at the thieves. But who am I to say? And that makes me wonder, where do people get their underlying ethical foundations from? Also, to what extent do people even have them?
Well, before I answer that, do you think that if you had some sort of personal experience that you were able to relate to either the person who had told on the other individual, or if you were in the position where you were the one that was stealing at a previous chapter of your life, do you think that would have impacted how you chose to look at what was ethical and what was unethical in that situation?
Quite possibly. Now, I did have a personal relationship with the person who was the thief. I didn't know who that was. I knew him before I knew he was a thief. I always actually really liked him. He and I had a friendly relationship. And it's weird, although I know he is a thief, or at least I believe that he is a thief, I actually still have a little bit of affection for him. I don't just condemn him altogether as a human being, nor do I condemn anyone altogether as a human being, although, of course, I condemn stealing. I think that's horrible. In terms of the relationship that I might have had with anyone else that was involved in this, or with the idea, or if I had been the person who was the thief myself, if I had been the person who was a thief myself, I would have been mad at whoever reported me, whoever busted my rear end. Yes, I would have been mad. Would I have really been mad, though? Would I have been more mad at myself for getting caught, or would I have really been mad that I got caught rather than them? Would I have been genuinely shocked that someone would report me? I mean, after all, I would have been hiding my thieving ways. So clearly I thought if I was hiding it, that someone would report me. That's a difficult question. But what are the ethics of someone that would steal? I wonder if the thief thought he was an ethical person.
Yeah. Have you ever shoplifted?
When I was a kid, I went to a grocery store with my mom. I think I was maybe 5 or 6, maybe 5, and I saw some delicious grapes or something like that. And I stuck them in my pocket. And as we were in the at the cash register line, my mother said, "Scott, do you have anything in your pockets?" And I had my hands in my pockets, and she said, "Scott, do you have anything in your pocket?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Take your hand out of your pocket." Or maybe the cashier said, "Take your hands out of your pocket." I said, "No." And they said, "Take your hands out of your pocket." And I did. And of course, there were some grapes in there. My mother slapped me. Bam. She went totally Joan Crawford on me. Everyone knows who Joan Crawford is, right? I don't want to be talking about people that are so old, but everyone knows who Mommy Dearest is. Right? You know who Mommy Dearest is, right, Jessica? We all have a Mommy Dearest. I had a Mommy Dearest. We didn't have a Mommy Dearest, but in that moment, she was totally Mommy Dearest.
It's funny that you mentioned that because I've had similar I have similar experiences of shoplifting, but one of them in particular that I remember, and it's interesting because it wasn't until years later that I realized what I was actually doing. So my mom and I, we used to go to this grocery store every time after school or soccer practice, whenever it was, and we would typically start at the back aisles and then make our way towards the front, towards the checkout. And one of the very last aisles, it was a bakery. So there were donuts, bagels, and stuff like that. And I used to always ask my mom whether or not I can have a donut. In most situations, she would say yes, as long as I'm not having dinner that like next minute after we leave the grocery store. And so I would take this donut, and what I didn't realize or didn't register in my head that typically when you take food at the grocery store, you bag it and then you wait to eat it until you get to the cashier. Well, what I started to do is I would just eat it as we're walking through the aisles. So by the time we get to the cashier, not only have I finished a donut, which would probably finished it halfway or as we were walking through the first aisle, but I also forgot that I had a donut. So now that I think about it, I probably owe at least, I don't know, 20 or 30 bucks to that grocery store. But it's interesting to see how there are just certain things that become habitual. And it's not by any fault of my mom for not knowing or reminding me. It's just that she might have thought that, okay, he's probably going to do what I'm going to do, and that's put it in a bag, not eat it at the grocery store as he's walking through the aisles. And I thought complete opposite. I thought, what better place to do it than eat it now? I used to do the same thing with Gatorade, especially when I was extremely thirsty. I don't know if you've ever experienced this, or Jessica, or anyone else that's listening, but those moments when you walk into a store or convenience store, or gas station, whatever it is, and you just literally are dying for some water or some sort of liquid.
Yeah, of course.
So I walked into grocery stores when I was younger, way back in the day, and I'll grab the Gatorade or I'll grab two of them and finish one and accidentally set the empty bottle or throw it away in the trash cans, which I never understood why grocery stores had the trash cans, right? That would be the number one way to get rid of whatever it is that you were eating in the store. So, I would do that sometimes. But now that I think about it, this is 10 or 12 years later, which I think is the statute of limitations there, right? 10 years?
Depends on where you live. It might be forever if it's for Gatorade.
Oh, right. That's true, if there's a limited supply. But did I ever think of that being unethical? I don't think so. I don't think so. And I think one of the reasons why is because having seen other people do it, it's not to say that I realized that was a common behavior. I understood that whatever's at the store, you have to pay for. But I think there are certain situations where I genuinely forgot. In the case of the donuts, I forgot that I actually consumed a donut because my mind was so occupied either on helping my mom or getting ready for dinner or whatever it was.
Well, we've all done that. And look, I had a situation where I did that. I grew up in the Midwest. It was a very religious part of the country. And being a boy who loved action, adventure, violence, color, shock, gore, fantastical events, I naturally loved the children's Bibles. They had all those things. It was the best thing ever. Floods, people turning into pillars of salt. What more could a young kid like me who likes action and adventure and gore and shock and all these things ask for? And so one time I went to a department store and I was like just rifling through the pictures of this children's Bible to see what shocking scenes they would have pictures of. And I was so riveted that as I realized, oh no, I need to go meet my mom or dad outside, I just tucked that Bible into my arms and walked out of the store with it without paying. So I accidentally stole a Bible. First of all, is it ethical to steal a Bible?
That might be one of the ultimate ones where you cross the line.
Right? I might be a blasphemer, damned to hell forever for that. I realized and I brought it back, and I was so concerned about my soul. All those lightning strikes and punishment, I knew they were going to happen to me. And Jessica says God would allow it. Thank you, Jessica. I'll tell him that as I slide down after I die for that particular sin. Yeah. So, but intent matters, or does it?
Yeah.
Right. Because I doubt that it was unethical to accidentally steal that Bible or to eat that donut and forget to pay. But once you knew about that donut that you ate, have you paid them? That is where I would see the ethical line drawn. But do you believe that you can still be unethical even if you had no intent to be unethical?
Probably. And I think now that I think about it, not that I've been put on the spot to think about how many donuts have I had at that grocery store and how much do I owe an exact penny, it would be hard for me to really articulate that and remember. So I think if anything, what I've learned throughout my own life is that in those situations where, let's say, I did something that is considered to be wrong at a particular time, later on, what I've realized is that I just try and make up for it in other forms. Mm-hmm. So go volunteer somewhere or buy a donut for someone else standing in line, whatever it is. Like that, to me, is my way of paying back, because I have no idea how many donuts. And I also think that, once again, this is just an assumption. The reality could be completely different. But if I were to go to that grocery store now, I mean, how long has it been? 14 years by now, maybe even longer. And I find the manager, which is most likely going to be a different manager from the time. And I explained to them that, hey, when I was 12 or 13 years old, I took 7 of your donuts. How do I pay for that? Like, are they really going to care? Did $14 cause a possible bankruptcy conversation for a grocery store that's statewide? Like,
yeah, but you really don't know, because for all we know, that company could have been growing very quickly.
True.
They could have had issues with their vendors.
Yeah.
Or they could have had
my behaviors also triggered someone else's behaviors that, okay, this is something that's acceptable. So maybe I wasn't the only one that was doing that. Maybe there was extra, who knows? Maybe I could have set a chain reaction of other people doing similar stuff. And not only with donuts that cost 99 cents to $1, but with more expensive items, like Jessica had mentioned, the box of crackers.
Yeah.
I probably have done a similar thing where I open it. Now, with the box of crackers, it's a little bit harder because, I mean, it's a box, so it's very visible. So there's no way to get around but paying for it. So that was good that I was able to do things like that. But the other thing that I truly never understood, and this might be a little bit off subject, but in a situation like that, where let's say I know for a fact that my ethical decision is going to be to pay for the particular item, right? I go into the store and I choose to consume it there. Why is that something that's not allowed? I've never understood that.
What's how would that make sense? That they're going to get your money?
But
what are they going to do? Have someone stand and hold you there? They're not police people. They don't have a right to detain you.
So theoretically, you could leave.
Totally. Theoretically, in reality, you probably can leave. Those security guards you see at the store, how many of them are actually threatening to you? They might say, come with me. They might look big and tough. They might not.
That is, I didn't think about it that way.
Do
I thought it was kind of a law. You had to pay for it after.
I don't know. I mean, maybe it is a law somewhere, but I know security people, sometimes I'm not intimidated by them. If they're store security, am I really that intimidated by them? I guess they could call the police, or they could block me from leaving the store if it's big enough, or I could just walk out the store and say goodbye. What about not leaving a tip? Do you believe that that is unethical?
That's a hard one. Do I believe in not leaving a tip all the time? I don't know. I don't know if I subscribe to that. For example, during COVID, because we weren't able to go to many of the restaurants and dine in person. So let me backtrack actually. I believe that a tip is directly associated with the experience that you get at the particular place. So I give you a tip for some sort of service that is provided other than the basic preparation of the meal itself. That's how I understand it. So in situations where it's only, let's say, pickup, and during COVID, I know that many of the restaurants had the tip option open. I've questioned that. I've questioned it. And yes, in many of the situations, I left the tip not necessarily for the service, but to support some of these businesses who might have been struggling because no one was able to walk in. But in other situations prior to COVID, this was also a thing where certain restaurants would give the tip option on top of whatever the delivery fee and other fees were associated. That was a big question mark for me because I didn't fully understand that. And ethical or not unethical, I didn't know what to do. Like, what is the proper thing to do in that situation? Do I tip for a service that's not
tippable?
So if I'm already paying for the drive, I never fully understood that. And the other thing that I guess I've recently learned, and you know this better than I do, Scott, but the difference in tipping in United States compared to Europe and some of the other countries. Like what I've heard is that in some of these other countries, tips are not accepted.
Yeah, or they'll be considered an insult
in the bill somehow, or they're considered an insult. So I don't know. The other thing that I find challenging, and I remember having a conversation with another friend of mine about the same exact thing. He had said that he tips all the time, regardless of the service. Now, I do the same thing, but my percentage varies depending on the service. So if I get an exceptional service, to me, an exceptional service is if you're going to tell me, A, this is the order I'm going to receive, and B, it doesn't take me a lifetime to receive it, then I tip whatever the percentage is. Now, if it takes an hour longer, and let's say I ordered a burger and I get a hot dog, does that situation deserve a tip? And is it considered unethical to not tip when literally the order was wrong and the delivery, which in a way delivery is an interesting one for me because here's why. If you as a server going to tell me in a way like make a promise that your food will arrive shortly, some people do it by minutes. Some people say your food will arrive in 10 to 15 minutes. My question is, why make a promise that is not realistic to actually uphold? So if it takes 40 minutes and you promise 15, why even say that? Why not just say, I'll bring the food out when it's ready?
Jessica had two insightful comments about this at the bottom of the comment thread. I will say, based on the one that she just put up, just as an addendum to that, sometimes it's not the wait staff's fault.
Yeah.
When I worked for the Brooklyn Press, which was a printing company that I used to co-own, myself and the sales staff would many times make promises to the client based on, for instance, what we were told by the production staff their capacity was or their capabilities were or what we could and should expect.
Yeah.
And we did that because we needed to close the sale or because the Client had the right to know. I mean, they were spending their money and they needed to make decisions based on certain representations that we would have. And then inevitably, not inevitably, but more times than I would like to admit, issues would come up that would cause that deadline to be missed, or we would be late, or there would be some last minute this, that, and the other, or there would be some issue that came up during production that was just part of the production process that really was no one's fault.
Right.
And there was nothing we could do about it. So for instance, an example might be a snowstorm that kept UPS from delivering to us the t-shirts that we needed in order to print. We made a promise that we would get it to them in 10 days, but we cannot control a snowstorm, nor can we control UPS. As a matter of courtesy, we often would refund the UPS fees or end up having to forfeit the order. That was, and it goes as to actually something Jessica mentioned in her earlier comment, which was the client's perspective was, well, we paid you, so we want to hold you accountable for this. And we had to abide by that, but there were times when that was devastating to us. The idea that a crime is victimless because there is an assumption that all businesses have set aside certain money, such as Jessica's friend was talking about. You and I both know as entrepreneurs, that's not true, particularly if the business is growing is in a growth phase, or even if it's just starting. Literally, a few cents might make the difference between making payroll or not. You could not, for instance, I could not, and that was what, just as an aside, made payroll unbelievably stressful for me. I had to predict 3 days in advance how much cash we would have in the bank, down to the cent. And so if we were so much as 1 cent over what was in the bank account when payroll time came, payroll would stop. We'd get a call from the payroll company saying, sorry, we can't process it. And I'd have to call the bank, and I'd literally have to run to the bank and put $1 in, or a quarter, or something like that. There were other times where we would have some last minute thing that was out of control, or a client would decide they weren't going to pay, and we were counting on that revenue, and I sacrificed my paycheck for that, and I needed the money. Or I put money out of my own savings and put it into payroll so that our staff could get paid. So I don't know that I really believe that those sorts of things are victimless, as Jessica's friend indicates. I was a victim. My staff could have been a victim if I didn't have enough savings to just plunk it down and cover their payroll. And then if I never got that money from the person at all, which fortunately, thank goodness, I was an attorney and could threaten consequences on them if they chose to continue non-payment. But even that might take a while to resolve. If it was just some regular business person that didn't have that sort of credential behind them, it may have really incurred a cascading financial loss in that company that most people can't comprehend.
Slightly unrelated, but do you believe that the customer is always right?
No. And we didn't operate that way, by the way, as a company. Sometimes the customer, we believed in radical accountability, and that if we actually were wrong, but for instance, there was a situation where an individual ordered some tote bags from us. Mm-hmm. And this is one of those random things that we can't control that are part of the production process. And we had told her we could get everything to her in 10 days, but it turns out that the particular tote bag she had ordered was not in stock. No supplier had it anywhere, and they had never told any of on the websites that you would look at to pick out those particular wholesale items. They'd never mentioned it, so there's no way we could have known. So what we did is we said, this is actually another tote bag that's heavier and nicer than the one you ordered and paid for. It's more expensive than the one you paid for, and it's the one that we can get in time to still meet your deadline. Do you want to proceed with this one sight unseen? And she said, yes. So we got her the tote bag and we printed it. And then when we sent the tote bag to her, we got a very angry call, number of calls. And what was the call about? The tote bag that you gave me is too light. It's not heavy enough. And I reminded her that it was heavier than the one she had picked. And she said, yes, but you picked this one. And I said, well, had we conferred in with you and we offered you the choice of just not having your order fulfilled, and you said you had to have them. And she said, I want a refund. This bag is too light. I paid for it. And you were the ones who printed it, and you were the ones who picked this bag for me, and you're the ones who need to be held accountable for this. Was the customer right? I told her I did not feel the customer was right. No. And another time, I'm sorry to go off on this, but you obviously hit a nerve. Another time, we're working with a design company who asked us to print a massive number of aprons and T-shirts and hundreds, even thousands, I think. And then they said, you have to send it to this address. So we sent it to that address. Then the day of its delivery, I got an hysterical phone call. We didn't get these things that you sent. And I said, well, we sent them on time. We sent them to the address. Well, that was the wrong address. Can you this is the correct address. Can you send them there? And I said, I am in the middle of something else right now, and I sent them to the address that you send them to. I will try. And she said, well, you need to drop everything that you're doing this now. We're your client. Customer is always right. And I said, the customer is right, but not when they send us the wrong address. Then later they came back and said, we're going to go to another vendor if you do not split the UPS bill, which was over $1,000. And I flatly refused. No. We send it to the address that you gave us. Yes, you gave us the wrong one, but the customer always being right as a mantra. Our motto is print, make friends, repeat. But friends is a two-way street.
I like
so
that.
In both of those cases, the customer was not always right. And I actually, going back to the central theme, felt that they were being unethical. And trying to exploit our customer-centric, our client-centric approach. Yeah. But do you think that I was being the jerk? I've been accused of being a jerk before.
No, I think in that situation, that was the ethical thing to do. That's what I would have done, is processed it through that lens, is instead of trying to accommodate to the error that was made on the other end. However, I have been on the other end, not the same exact situation, but there's situations. For example, there's one instance in particular. I remember I had a new bank account here in Austin, and I accidentally connected that bank account instead of the bank account that had a lot more funds in to my utility bill. So when the utility bill, or when the utility company charged me the bill on that particular month, they ended up charging the bank account that had insufficient funds. Therefore, I had not only whatever negative balance, but like overdraft fees and all these other stuff. And so I remember calling the bank, and I was explaining to the individual the situation that took place. And I even said to them that, hey, this is my fault, but I'm wondering if there is a one-time courtesy that we can reverse some of these charges. Just like anything else, the very first person says, nope, there's nothing I can do. And just knowing who I am, and I think you know who I am at this point.
The whole world knows who you are.
Relatively persistent. And I had told the person, I said, well, could you put me in touch with someone who can help me? They put me in touch with the next person. That person says, nope, I can't help you. I asked the same question. Could you put me in touch with someone who can help me? So I ended up talking to the vice president of this bank at the end of the day. She reviewed my case, and she first stated that, hey, there's nothing we can do about this, because if we reverse this for you, then we have to reverse it for everyone. Well, here's my caveat there, okay? If that is the truth, not only do I know from past experience that the company is not going to do that, but B, I think there is something that also talks about, or there's something important about those that choose to create opportunities. I think I don't know how to explain this, but for example, in that particular situation, I was creating an opportunity to resolve a problem. Yes, I was in the wrong, and I acknowledged that throughout the whole way. But just because I chose to reach out, I don't think it was necessarily an ethical thing of them to do for everyone. Just like I don't believe in some of these other situations where if I choose to put myself out there and create certain opportunities, is it the ethical thing to do of any organization to do the same exact thing for everyone else? You know, if I go, and I don't know if I'm making sense here, but like if I go after a certain goal, or wanting to have someone on the podcast, does that person feel obligated to be saying yes to every single opportunity that comes across their plate, where people don't choose to go the same exact extreme and reach out to them? So anyway, long story longer, towards the end of that conversation with the bank person, they had made the change, and I even said to her the same exact thing. I said that they did that, but obviously they can choose whether or not they make the exception for everyone. But I just knew that from previous experience they won't.
Mm-hmm.
The other example that I'll briefly bring up is, and I think this might be one that you might be able to, well, I don't know, you might be able to relate to in some form or fashion, or Jessica or anyone else that's listening. But for example, when you buy cars, now I don't know what anyone else's process is when it comes to buying a vehicle, but I'm the individual who very rarely buy the vehicle without a form of negotiation. A, I love to negotiate, and B, I love to negotiate. So when I go into a particular conversation like that, if you tell me $12,000, I'm going to negotiate with you because I genuinely like it, not just because I know I can get a lower price, which I internally know I can. So is that an unethical thing that happens on my end as far as negotiating with someone else, and especially when it comes to on their price? Like, do you believe that's an ethical or unethical practice to negotiate for a lower price?
No, I think that's ethical. Jessica has a husband who is in car sales, so she has some expertise on that. I don't think that that is unethical. Are there approaches to negotiations that are unethical? That's a different story. However, in your case, as the consumer, I don't think the power is usually in your hands to be able to behave unethically, unless you just lie about something. But in my experience, car salespeople or other negotiation, transactional experts like that tend to be able to uncover that sort of information very well. Or if they're negotiating with individuals, those individuals really aren't in a position to have something to hide because they're not the ones seeking the item that is of value to them. They're the buyer. It is on the or the condition of a house that you're purchasing or anything else like that, because then the person who is doing the bidding on whatever that item is doesn't necessarily have full information, so they can't enter into fully informed negotiate. The discussions that they have are always just based on what they see. And so there was a situation where I was working with a company to purchase another company. And it turned out that the company that was proposed to be purchased was hiding some pivotal information about its internal operations. And that ended the negotiations for the purchase. Mm-hmm. Because the purchase price that had been previously agreed on, or that had been sort of the target, was based on these things not being in place.
Do you think there is something that is unethical to try and negotiate on?
Yes. Human life.
Human life.
Or humans as property. Slavery. It was unethical to negotiate the price of a slave. Mm-hmm. It was unethical to have a slave, but it was independently unethical to negotiate the price of a slave. I just want to say, hi, Melody. It is good to see you. Thank you for joining us. Some might argue that it's unethical to negotiate the price of an animal because it's setting the value of a living creature that to itself is more important than anything else. It's giving that an economic value. Yeah. And who are we to say that? Do you agree with that as someone who's a dog owner?
I think that is an unethical thing to do. Correct.
Jessica says,
I find it challenging to even, just adoptions in general. That's I can't say it's I don't know how I feel about that. Unethical or ethical. I think depending on the situation, but I think if anything, I find it challenging is setting a price on a living being, such as an animal or a human, myself included, or yourself included, considering our things. So it's interesting. I want to bring up Jessica's question. Do you think it's unethical for one's internet service to be disrespectful when he is on live videos? What are your thoughts on that?
Actually,
Give us some pros and cons here.
Jessica, now you should know better than to ask that question. You already had me laughing when you mentioned wire hangers earlier. Is it unethical to disrupt a live podcast by talking about movie stars who have an aversion to wire hangers? You did that. Let's talk about this, though, because I think embedded in that lighthearted question is a more serious one, which is, do we believe that the internet service outages, which we have experienced during the past year and a half, upon which our economy is dependent,
correct,
and that we have no option, really, of doing anything about outside of unplugging and pulling ourselves out of the economic sphere altogether, which I suppose is a choice we have, but it's, let's be real, that's not one many people are able to take, especially if you have a child or a family to support and don't want to be put in jail for child abuse. You are reliant on these service providers, and they break down all the time. And we don't have a negotiation tool as individuals available to us. The government agencies that allegedly do this for us usually are more likely to hear from the service providers than any individuals. Jessica says her husband negotiates literally everything, which I totally believe. But actually, can we negotiate pro rata price reductions for internet service drops? We can't.
I do.
And do you get anywhere?
Sometimes, yeah.
And is it worth the opportunity costs?
No, because it's way longer. It takes me way longer to speak to a live individual about the matter than what it will actually take me to make the money in that hour. So,
and by the way, do we think that might be intentional?
That's a good question. I don't know if it's necessarily theoretically speaking, because I think there's probably some real components to it, but I have wondered the same exact thing, because I've noticed similar patterns, especially when it comes to towards the end of a billing cycle, in situations where, let's say, you have an internet bill due in the next 3 to 4 to a week. I've noticed gradual slowdown. And whenever I'd call, the very first option that I'm always given is to upgrade. It's not to resolve the current situation.
It's to pay more money.
Upgrade to a higher service so the disruptions would stop.
Right, which they never do.
So that's where I've really questioned as far as what is ethical in those situations. And I guess the other question for me is, how would I really know whether or not that was a decision that they made besides somehow breaking into their company servers and figuring out who did what? But do you believe in the same thing? Like, do you think that's an intentional,
of course,
action that happens sometimes? Like, that's got to, right? Otherwise, what else would make sense? Like, why is it that the 27th of every month the internet goes out?
Yeah, and why
the bill
is it
due on the 28th?
Yeah, and why is it that despite these companies being some of the largest entities in the world and customer service people on the phone being some of the lowest paid people in the world, they always seem to be overwhelmed with calls? Clearly, customer service isn't a priority, or they would appropriately staff. But I do think personally that it's a little bit more pernicious than that they deliberately want to keep people waiting so that people drop off in frustration and drop the hassle.
Yeah. Well, I'll share a quick true story a friend of mine had shared with me. So he used to work for a company. Once again, I'm not going to name the name of the company or the service that they did or his name. He worked for this company, and one of the things that they used to do was whenever they would get some calls, typically they were able to predict the pattern. So I think he said every Tuesday or Wednesday, they would get calls from X hour to X hour, and most of those calls were customer complaint calls.
Mm-hmm.
So what they actually did intentionally was they made sure, you know how sometimes when you call a company and before you reach a representative, you hear some sort of music.
Yes.
They would pick specific songs that would make the individual more annoyed with the service that they would hang up the phone.
Oh.
So that was a true strategic move on their end to make something like that happen. I don't know the songs. Maybe it was the same song on repeat, just a constant loop, and they
Wow.
played that 5 or 6 times. I've had the same thing happen with, I don't think my bank does that, but I've had the same thing when I would call the bank and it's the same song on repeat. And let's say if I stay on a line 5 or 10 minutes, I just hang up the phone.
Yes. Melody makes a very good point, which is that by engaging in these tactics,
Yeah.
the companies are unilaterally raising the price. They are renegotiating the terms of service based on the fact that you have no leverage in the relationship.
Yeah, it's true. It's a very good point. Jessica also brings a really funny point. I find it funny. She says she's calling hers tomorrow. My internet went out right before my show tonight, and I was stressed.
Yeah,
I would be the same way.
too.
You know, it's
Yeah.
like it's challenging to be in those situations because, at least for me, you don't know who's responsible for it.
Right.
It's like the same thing of the waiter story that we were talking about. If your food is late, I mean, is it really on the waiter or is it something in the kitchen? There might have been a critical piece of equipment that literally broke down before your meal had to be prepared. So who's responsible for that, and who should be held accountable, and who is the quote unethical party in that particular situation? Is it the last one? Is it the last person at the end of the chain, or is it the first one, or is it someone in the middle?
Then also, to what extent are ethics involved when there are behaviors that we engage in out of fear? So,
Yeah.
I tip generously, and I don't screw around with wait staff because A, I know that they don't get paid a lot. B, because I like feeling comfortable with the food that goes into my mouth. So, for instance, someone I knew at one point in my past worked for a restaurant where a regular customer who was abusive to the wait staff would get very drunk on wine and not notice the salty taste of some of the white wine that he would get later in the night. Was his behavior, let's assume that his behavior of being abusive to the wait staff was unethical. But did that justify the response that the wait staff chose to share with him?
That's a good question.
And Jessica says, no, yes, it happened.
That's a difficult position to be in because from our lens, yes, that's an unethical thing to do. But at the same time, not knowing what was said and how that was received and how that impacted the other individual. I mean, depending on the comments, it's interesting that we're even talking about something like this because prior to our conversation, I was listening to another conversation about NBA basketball players and how they handle conflict. And one of the things that was brought up during this conversation was literally the same exact point. What's ethical and what's unethical. So here you have a group of players, professional athletes, playing a game on a basketball court in front of arenas that can be from 15 to 20,000 to sometimes 50,000 people. And then you get situations sometimes where, let's say, an angry fan gets up and throws popcorn at you. But due to the athlete's response to that fan, the athlete is the one that gets penalized. So it's an interesting situation because who is the one that's unethical in a situation like that. I personally have been in games, I think it's maybe somewhat related to your point, where some of the fans would do some things like that, throw popcorn, throw coins at players, spit on them, say every curse word in the book as they're going into the locker room, and they don't get removed from the arenas.
Mm-hmm.
But
And
when
Melody,
the player responds, the player is either automatically ejected, has to pay a fine at the end of the game, or somehow removed from that game. So it's interesting that you bring that up, because unless I put myself in the other shoes, it's very difficult to judge, like, what would I do and what would be considered unethical and ethical behavior in those situations.
Melody also points out another factor that is at play in all of these situations, which is the existence of a boss that could be handling this. It may be the coach, or it may be whomever. It may be someone who's managing that particular event, or the security staff at the event, assuming they're actually paid something and are actually do things about crowd behavior. And in the case of the restaurateur, she's saying that the boss should not have let the wait staff be abused. I assume that she might say, at least, that in the sports arena, whoever's managing the event should not allow the player to be abused that way.
Yeah.
Or should quickly, right, like the situation should never even be allowed to escalate. And so it goes us to the ethics. And this is a big ethical question, and I'd love to think about it and would love to hear what are the ethical obligations of bystanders.
Yeah.
Bystanders. I'm sorry, I may have said bystanders. Bystanders.
Unethical error there. But that's a really good point, though. In those situations, and I think this goes outside of sports, when you see a behavior that's considered unethical, do you become unethical for not choosing to speak up and do what is considered to be ethical, or not? Or is not a shared responsibility? When the whole COVID situation, going back to COVID, because that's kind of the hot topic for the day, for the year. But when it all started and the whole concept of wear a mask, don't wear a mask, broke out, like, was it unethical of one individual to tell the other individual to wear a mask before things were known that, okay, vaccines can help you in X, Y, and Z way, before even vaccines existed? That wasn't too long ago. So I don't know. I think it's an interesting question. Like, what is considered to be the ethical behavior when you are seeing someone do an unethical act?
This happened a lot at the gym that I work out at.
Yeah.
When they reopened, they had pretty strict mask mandates. And you would see people walking around in the gym without masks on, or they would wear their masks like this sort of quote unquote mask wearing. I'll illustrate it for you.
Yeah.
Right. Or like this. And that's the sort of thing where they would argue that the gym was behaving in an unethical way by forcing them to wear masks. I personally think, by the way, that argument as a matter of ethics is pretty weak due to the fact that no one is forcing you to go to any particular gym. They really weren't. You didn't have to go. No one was putting a gun to your head and said, go to the gym and wear a mask. So if you were making a choice to go somewhere that you knew full well had a mandate and you didn't want to pay attention to it, and that mandate, by the way, was backed up by the force of law, and you wanted to break the law and put that gym at risk of being closed, then I thought that was not the strongest ethical foundation to stand on.
Yeah.
However, what about those who saw you without your mask when the staff wasn't looking? Yeah. Similarly, fights would erupt over that sort of thing. Sometimes people would look the other way. Sometimes people would get into very, very heated, ominous discussions, usually between someone who was wearing a mask and those that were not. And sometimes the mask just this morning at the gym, they have not removed a mask mandate, but they do not enforce it. So you have half of the gym walking around without a mask, half of it the people walking with one on. And today I heard some people talking very loudly about, and they were not wearing masks, saying, oh, finally, there's freedom in the United States. There's too much freedom. I don't know if people in this gym are going to be able to handle all this freedom. They're not going to be able to oppress people anymore, this, that, and the other. And there were people around them that were wearing masks. So they were basically making, through their yelling and their pointed proclamations, in a passive aggressive way, verbal attacks or attempting to put public pressure on those that were still wearing masks to take them off. Was that ethical behavior?
That's a good question. I think it somewhat relates to Melody's point. A lack of response can also be seen as approval. And I wonder, in situations like that, where if there was a lack of response as far as what is the requirement at that particular business, could also have been an unethical reaction or response, or considered to be unethical response to something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think a lot of this, going back to Jessica's point as well, I think a lot of this goes to perspectives, and it goes to the particular leadership at hand. And because there's so many different forms of leaders to begin with, it's hard for me to draw the line as far as, okay, this is a for sure ethical, this is a for sure unethical, because so much of it is a matter of perspective. I mean, there are businesses here in Austin, as I'm sure other parts of Texas, as well as all over the world, that don't require masks anymore, and others do. And, there's probably going to be a time where we're going to have to show vaccination cards, and not like what's ethical within that and what's not. I have no idea.
But where does it stop? I understand the complexity of the mask issue, and I'm actually not, well, I won't state my own opinion about it, but I will say that it's been made clear throughout the public discourse on this matter that there are many strong opinions about that, and that people have very different ethical opinions about it. In fact, the very fact that this individual was yelling out loud about freedom and mask wearing and not in the gym is evidence of that exact point.
Yeah.
But where do perspectives stop? For instance, some people might say that all sorts of atrocities, genocides even, can occur, and it was justified by a belief system. And that was my perspective. It was my perspective that land that where a nation state had not been established firmly was ours to take. So therefore, let's just take the United States from the people who were already inhabiting it. It's just a matter of perspective, one might say, as entire populations were rounded up into reservations.
Yeah.
You didn't have any right to this land. You're not willing to integrate into our society, so go to that reservation. Some people argued things like that.
Yeah. And how do you get to a consensus in something like that, considering that at least I haven't come across a situation where you've had 100% buy-in from everyone.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another thing that I wondered, is like, what is considered to be a consensus to begin with? Because going back to Jessica's point, who am I to decide that one's personal ethics are unethical just because I'm able to see it through a different lens due to a variety of experiences, interactions, whatever it is? So it's a harder one. I don't personally know. I think it's a harder question to answer. And just because someone sees the world differently, does it make it less valid than mine? I don't think so. I think it makes it different, but at the same time, how do you come to common ground within that? Like, for example, if you don't believe in everyone having, I don't know, equal opportunity to life or whatever it is, and I do, and how do we come to common ground? Is the common ground for me to convince you of why my point is right and yours is not? Or is like on some of these other bigger issues, what is the compromise?
And can there be one? I had an interesting ethical discussion a few years ago about certain Middle Eastern countries. Saudi Arabia was the one at the time that we were explicitly discussing. The individual that I was having the conversation with, the debate about, was a woman who is very strongly committed to the idea that Westerners are in no position to sit around and judge other cultures and make economic decisions that hurt those cultures merely because we disagree with the fundamentals of those other countries' value systems.
Yeah.
And my retort to her was, yeah, Saudi Arabia doesn't let women drive a car.
Yeah.
Or walk out in public on their own. They have to get permission to do everything under the sun. There are all sorts of repressive, extraordinarily misogynistic laws there. And I stand against that. And I think that those behaviors should be punished with negative economic sanctions. And I have no problem at all saying, I don't care what your lens is, treating half the population like they're chattel or children is wrong. It's unethical. And she, by the way, who is a feminist, very strongly disagreed with me. That was me importing Western values onto a culture that had no similar history to ours. And who was I to say anything? Who was I to even say that those women were suffering? She felt that for all I knew, and as a man, who was I to say that they might not have been? And then again, where does that stop?
Yeah.
Saudi Arabia, a lot of these countries execute people for being gay. As a gay person, I've got a problem with that. And I assume many people who are not gay, but who are friends of our community or who love people that are gay, or who might not even care one way or the other, but just don't like executions, may have a problem with that. Yeah. And is it really okay? Under no circumstances do I ever believe that as someone is about to be stoned to death, that they're enjoying their situation in life or just so glad that they're being executed against their will. But if we're going to all just say, well, everyone's lens counts, why shouldn't we just say, okay, that's cool, you disagree with me, so execute that person?
Yes. And that's a harder realization, harder point to find a concrete argument around, because I'm in a similar boat. As much as I genuinely do believe in this concept that everyone has a voice and everyone should have a voice, but at the same time, it's like, how do you come to resolutions in some of these situations where it does appear to be a black and white situation, like life or death? For me, it's as simple as that. Like, if that's the conversation we're having, I'm going to be on the side that chooses for the individual to live. And so I don't know. I really don't even know how to approach that conversation, because there are certain topics, and I think you might be able to agree with this, Scott and Jessica and Melody and everyone else that's listening, that you choose to agree to disagree, right? Like, if you don't like strawberries, okay, right. That's an agree to disagree topic. Like, there's no reason to find common ground for why you should like strawberries. But at the same time, if it's something like taking the life of an individual, not recognizing human rights as it's done not only in one country, but multiple countries in the world, where is that line? And to what degree do you also, as you were stating earlier, to what degree do you choose to acknowledge and value the culture of any given country? And to what degree do you impose your own in saying that, I guess, your way is the right way? And I don't know. I think it's a very complicated question. I think it's a very complicated question. And those questions, oftentimes don't have a concrete answer, and where does it stop is a good question.
Yeah.
To what degree do you acknowledge someone else's perspective and opinion, and then to what degree do you almost don't? Is that what ends up happening?
Well, and Jessica's example in the second to last comment in the comment thread, and Melody, I want to get to your comment in a very short amount of time as well. That example is significant because many times the commitment to eating a plant-based diet that does not involve consuming an animal is based on an ethical consideration. Sometimes it might be purely health considerations, but many times it is based on ethical, right? Who are we to say that we're superior to an animal and therefore have the right to eat it?
To kill it and eat it, yeah.
Yeah. And then if we're going to say, well, we can't just say our culture is better than anyone else's, because who are we to say that anyway? Well, if exactly as she's saying, eating animal flesh is a part of that culture.
Yeah.
What ethical principle governs? Even Melody's point, which is that if it hurts someone, it is unethical, even if not illegal. And I think that the one thing I love about what Melody said there is that she points out that ethics and legal stuff are not identical. I remember there was a friend of mine that was a pot smoker when I was in high school, and her best friend told her, you shouldn't be smoking it because it's illegal. And my friend said to her, well, the police don't do anything about it. They don't care. So why should you? And my friend said, well, because it's against the law. And even then in high school, I thought that was kind of a ridiculous argument. So what if the law is wrong? Slavery was Jim Crow. Those were all legal things. I didn't mean they were ethical. Yeah. But the animal issue is a different one, because there is hurt going on, irrespective of, even if the animal's killed in an ethical way or doesn't know that it's dying and doesn't suffer, its life ends. Is that an acceptable hurt for us? How much hurt is acceptable? What if it's a microaggression? What if it is a hurt that occurs without intent? Or what if it is something, an action that is intended to hurt but doesn't? An example of the latter was, I couldn't stand going to church when I was growing up. Our church services were so long. The minister would give these fire and brimstone sermons that just would never end, and they were boring. And so when I finally escaped to college, I didn't have to go to church anymore. And then when I would go home, my mother would say, oh, why don't we go to church? Why don't we go to church? And everyone will get to see you and it'll be fun. I'll get to show you off. So I would, after a long night of partying, I would get up and I would try and drag myself out of the bed to go to church. And I was slow. My mother was a believer that when she said we're leaving at 9:43 in the morning, she meant 9:43, not 9:44. And one day it was 9:43 and I wasn't ready. I was still tying my shoes. So she said, bye, you're being punished. You're not going to go. I'm just going to go without you. So she was intending to hurt me. But it was a punishment that was really a reward. I whipped those shoes off and went right back to bed. And it was the best Sunday morning that I ever had when visiting my parents. So was she behaving unethically by attempting to punish me for being a minute late? Or was I being unethical for being a minute late?
Yeah.
How much hurt and who's hurt governed?
You might know this as far as historical point of view. I'm laughing at Melody's recent comment, but was that always a thing as far as was it always acceptable to kill animals but not kill humans? Okay, not always. Like obviously, after certain events like slavery and some of these other events, like it changed. But I'm wondering, in the case of animals, was that always an acceptable behavior or an acceptable action?
Our species started out. Our species drove entire megafauna of continents to death, presumably to eat. And honestly, child sacrifice. This is a point that is controversial. Okay. But we have plenty of evidence in the Bible itself that in ancient Israel, even if the those that were following the belief system of the dominant deity there were not doing this. People in Israel and all of the surrounding city-states or whatever they were sacrificing children.
Yeah.
And we have evidence of the fact that practice continued for some time due to the fact that the Bible, the Old Testament in particular, is condemning it. So clearly they were condemning something that was going on all the time. And with regards to animals,
yeah,
right, there are places in the world where animal sacrifices still happen.
Yeah. It reminds me of Jessica's comment, and that's why I was briefly laughing.
Yeah.
If I shout obscenities at a person, then kill them, is that any different than if I fed you a nice meal and said I loved you before I killed you? It's true. You know,
yeah.
It's like it's a really good
yeah.
point.
And Jessica makes a good point even about the Bible.
Yeah.
Right, like the conquest of Israel after the escape from Egypt, assuming you believe that account.
Yeah.
People were slaughtered left and right. Their crime? They lived there. The city of Jericho, where they had these trumpets and the whole city came down, people died. What was their crime? They lived there.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know I don't know what a possible solution to the animal killing is. Obviously not to kill, but is at the same time, like, is that a realistic expectation to assume for the whole world to accept? I don't know. I think Melody pointed this out as well. Animal issue is a gray area. So how do you...
All the more so they'll eat us.
Yeah, how do you approach such situations exactly?
Yeah.
There are certain animals that are able to do it. So I think it's a interesting topic. And I remember for 1.5 to 2 years, maybe a little bit longer than that, I was vegan. And I'm not going to say it changed my life. I will say that it gave me a sense of clarity, and it really made me become a lot more aware of animals, and I think develop even deeper compassion for animals to begin with. Where now, and I don't know if you experienced this, Scott, or anyone else that's listening, but there are some times where I, let's say, eat chicken or other types of meat, let's say at a restaurant or at home, and like that thought randomly pops into my mind. Not randomly, I think it's somehow probably intentional thought that, what was that like? I mean, was this animal killed ethically? And the other thing that I don't fully understand, and maybe you can help me clarify this point, but ethics and organic, or some of those practices, is it fair to be assumed that some of those are ethical when they're labeled, when the items are labeled to be like cage-free or organic or something like that, or no?
Yeah, it's a heuristic. It's a substitute for our own ability to assess the situation and make a judgment. People can say ethically raised all they want. We don't know what that means, cage-free. So they might not be in a cage. They might just be in a stall. Or they might be in some horrible external environment when it rains, they can't get shelter.
That's very true. Once again, down the rabbit hole, but what makes something organic? Do you know?
Certification, raised with certain fertilizer requirements and certain other things.
Okay.
Yeah, Jessica says, right, many of these phrases are marketing. They don't mean anything special. We never really know.
Yeah.
Ethical implications of eating animals being a gray area. An example of that is the coronavirus itself.
Yeah.
Right, because there is, to the best of our current knowledge, at least based on the information that we know, the leading theory about how that originated is that it leapt from animals that were being kept in close quarters in markets where animals were for sale to eat, and went into the human population. And we know that many of the historical diseases that we have had since the beginning of the age of agriculture have been associated with domesticated animals getting diseases that mutated, or animals that are associated with humans getting diseases and mutating and going on to the human population. So irrespective of whatever happened with the coronavirus. And Jessica has a more cynical response. Yeah,
that is a really interesting. It's very interesting as far as what is actually how certain messaging is passed down, what it means, how it's produced, how it's mass produced, what it means within a particular culture or a country or a subgroup.
Yeah,
and how it's also like it's not always what you think it is. Just because it's organic or cage-free doesn't mean that it's an ethical practice, that it was.
And then what if the ethical practice ultimately leads to your own demise? So there was a woman that I knew who only ate organic food, and she bought organic peanut butter. She would not eat Skippy or whatever, as was her prerogative. And she got salmonella from it and almost died. And when she went to her doctor, he said, that's why you should not be eating organic food, because they don't have the things in them that will prevent you from getting these sorts of diseases. Now, I don't know whether the doctor was right or not. I don't know. But she believed that eating organic was ethical. If she had died, would it have been worth being ethical over peanut butter? Or should she have just eaten the damn Skippy?
I don't know. I want to slightly just pivot and go to another area that's kind of been in the back of my mind, but I think it's related to ethical and unethical. Do you think that in situations where you know or have a clear image of your sense of purpose or service or contribution that you bring to this world, do you think it's unethical of you to not exercise that every single
You are baiting me. Is it ethical to set someone up like that? You know what I'm going to say.
It's a legit
you know you're going to have my head spinning around now. Yes, I will say absolutely yes. It is unethical to have a purpose, to have the gifts that we've been given, and to not act on, if you have the opportunity. Now, let's say you were given the gift of a powerful vocal range and the ability to articulate words, and you live in Saudi Arabia and are female, and will be at risk or have no opportunity to even learn how to utilize that. I think that that's a different ethical calculus. But living in a free society or living in a strata of society where you have freedom and you've been given gifts and you've been given experiences and opportunity, and you have not done anything with it, or you have not done everything in your capacity to live that out in the world, I am radical and say with vehemence, yes,
all right,
that is unethical.
Here's another follow-up to our 20 questions here. Is it unethical to pursue the journey of finding that gift or finding that purpose?
Is it unethical?
Is it unethical to find your gifts and find your contributions?
Absolutely not. Why would that be unethical? To try.
Yeah,
I would say it would be unethical to not try.
That's what I meant.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I believe that is unethical. People don't commonly acknowledge it, but yes, I do believe that that is unethical.
So I was thinking about that the other day, and the thing that came to my mind was the same exact thing. Like, is it unethical to not try to go after finding whatever purpose and just kind of go along with, with life and do some of these things? But that's an interesting one. That's a really interesting one, because once again, I'm not here to judge, but I just simply observe and acknowledge many people that don't try to find that. And that's a harder, I don't know. That's a harder one. For me, that was a harder one not to meet with a sense of judgment to begin with. After a while of being able to process it in other ways and justify it to myself that everyone's on their own path and everyone's on their own journey, and now everyone wants what you want, but at the same time, there are some of these other things that for me are harder to get across and to like really understand. Like, and it's not necessarily, I'm not looking at it through the lens of like I'm doing more work than the other person, and why are they not doing the same amount of work? But it's more so a realization that I've had that when I have found my own sense of purpose at this chapter of my life, it then turned into a responsibility to create a space for other people to find their sense of purpose. And so in finding your purpose, I believe that there's actually tremendous value that can be gained from someone else who's observing your journey and can find their own steps to find their own meaning and their own purpose. So that's where, like, for me, that I was just curious what you thought, whether that was an unethical or ethical thing to not go after.
For many years, and Melody is right, we all have one. For many years.
Do you think it's enough? Not to interrupt you, but do you think a sense of purpose is enough to be alive? Is being alive enough when it comes to having a purpose?
As human beings with the brain structure that we have, I don't think it may be for some limited group of humanity. Those that do not have, in particular, I would say, the intellectual capacity to conceptualize purpose for themselves. Although I don't know to what extent even there is even such a subset. They say that dogs, for instance, some species of dogs, those that were bred to be worker dogs, get frustrated if they're not serving any purpose.
Yeah.
So even animals, to some extent, have a desire for purpose. And I would argue that many humans, most, have a stronger sense of intellect and thing than look. It can feel judgmental when someone says that we are behaving in a way that is unethical. But I also would argue that we have an ethical obligation to face our own ethical deficiencies. I look back on many years of my life with regret, Oleg, with regret, that I spent focused on weightlifting.
Yeah.
That I did any other of a number of other things that were not building my skills, building my community or sense of connection with others, not building anything except my unsatiated desire for whatever ego gratifications that I needed.
Yeah.
And those behaviors, I have to, as someone said today, and this is genderizing something I don't know should be genderized, but this person said it well. You have to be man enough to face it. Maybe an adult enough to face it would be a better way to put it.
Yeah.
But I need to face that according to my own standards, I failed. Now, failing ethically to me is only human. What do we do once we face that and acknowledge it is a different story altogether.
Yeah. I'm in a similar boat. I think when it comes to failure, it's just part of the process. And if anything, what I've learned to do is not to judge some of the people, not some, but everyone that fails in whatever way or that might be, failing in a relationship, failing in a business, failing in aspects of personal life. If anything, I think those are all opportunities to grow, to learn from, to identify, like you said, some of those areas that need additional attention. I was listening to an interesting interview, or part of an interview. I believe it was, I forget the woman's name. She started a huge company, Spanx. Sarah Spaley, something like that. But anyway, she was sharing the story how when she was younger, one of the things that her dad instilled in her is that failure mindset, the redefining what failure looks like. In fact, what he did every single day is he asked her and her brother what it is that they failed at that particular day. So I thought that was an interesting
It's
approach.
amazing.
Talk about getting comfortable with a concept that is
Yeah.
oftentimes shied away from, when it has a lot of stigma when it comes to it.
Yeah.
What better way to do it rather than to literally force yourself to fail? Now, I think there is a fine line between that. I think from my experience, as much as I push myself to failure in certain situations, I think there are certain things that don't make sense to bring the same level of intensity to. For example, certain financial hardships, like I don't think it's necessary, in my opinion, I don't think it's necessary to push yourself to failure to some of those things where some of the other things cannot be met, you know, bills or certain decisions, so that you have to be forced to go on the street the following day. I think that's a harder one. But at the same time, I mean, looking at the journey of entrepreneurship and looking at failure, that's kind of like a key ingredient to starting a business, which a little sidetrack from ethical and unethical, but it's maybe not. Maybe not. What if entrepreneurship is your contribution to the world? Therefore, it's unethical not to pursue it, and to pursue anything else is the unethical thing. I don't know.
Well, one thing that I can say is that out of difficult ethical choices
Yeah.
and out of failure come great stories. Where can people who are interested in great stories go to hear some?
One of the places is called Overcoming Odds, and that's something that Jessica and Melody and everyone else here that's familiar with. It's a podcast that we host, comes out a couple times a week, where we have similar conversations like this and just explore some of these topics at depth. In fact, tomorrow we're going to have a conversation about, I believe the topic is, what or do you care about what other people think of you? And if so, why? And I know it's going to be quite the conversation, considering that the number of people involved within that. You, Casey, Nancy John, Bodie, who's been a guest on both of our shows. And so that's one. The other one's called Power of Your Story. Similar platform, similar conversations, happens every single Sunday. There's going to be one this Sunday, and the topic will be around the concept of disability and exploring the different stigmas that are on disabilities.
Sounds amazing.
I know you have a similar space like that as well. What is that?
Absolutely. Scott Mason's Purpose Highway at purposehighway.com. It tells the stories of entrepreneurs, influencers, and other leaders who have connected to a higher purpose to build a better self and a better world. But I am beginning to make announcements about this to people. As you know, Oleg, that podcast is going to be shifting directions very soon.
Yeah.
It is in the final few episodes of season 1. Season 2 is going to go in a new direction.
And do you think that's ethical or unethical?
I think it is an ethical imperative that it move in that new direction, because the world needs to discuss what will be the topic. We have a #1 New York Times bestseller who will be coming up as one of our guests, and many other very, very compelling guests as well. In fact, Oleg, down the road, I want you to be one of the guests on that particular episode, on that particular iteration of the show, because you will be able to speak about the themes of this podcast. And for those of you who might be curious as to what those themes are, I'm going to hold you in suspense for now.
Yeah, that's unethical, but that's okay.
But I will tell you all this. I'm excited because the themes are going big.
One other thing that I just want to briefly mention to everyone that's tuning in right now is if you feel like this show has helped you in whatever way, or even having these conversations, I think it would be unethical of me not to ask for you to leave us a review either on Facebook or LinkedIn. Those are the two main platforms, YouTube, that we're primarily on. So unless Scott has anything else to add to it, I
I
figure
just
those are
want to say,
worthwhile things to
no,
do.
absolutely. I think that you're absolutely right. Jessica, Melody, thank you for your contributions. I know that there are folks that watch this show afterwards. And so I will say to you right now, and I've received texts from you, and I'm sure Oleg has too, thanking us or making comments about the impact of this on their lives. Continue to watch, continue to comment, continue to feel. And Jessica, Melody, hopefully we will indeed, as Jessica has indicated, see you tomorrow.